All right, part 3, we're going to talk about collective bargaining, traditional, which is unions, and non-traditional approaches. And so what is collective bargaining? Well, it's simply nurses getting together so that they have a collective voice in the workplace. Instead of each person asking for a fair wage and a safe workplace, people get together and say, we want a fair wage. So we're going to talk about some milestones. We're going to compare traditional and non-traditional collective bargaining quite great length. Some conditions that would have nurses seek traditional or non-traditional choices, and look at some positive and negative aspects, because there are positive and negative to everything. So really, is there a place for collective bargaining in nursing? And that's a good question, because administrators and nursing supervisors fail to recognize and address the nurses' individuals and collective needs sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. This is a very company by company, hospital by hospital problem. Some places are wonderful. Some, not so much. So some nurses find that collective bargaining is the best way that their voice is heard, because it isn't just their voice. So when Medicare and Medicaid first started in 1965, that was really the driving force of collective bargaining in nursing. Medicare, Medicaid, and then right after that, health insurance companies brought health care to many people who never had it. Prior to that, there just weren't a lot of insurance companies. There was no Medicare, Medicaid. So if you didn't have insurance, you paid cash for everything. And that got expensive. So people didn't go to the doctor a lot because it was expensive. Now suddenly, in 1965, Medicare comes along, Medicaid, there's more patients, more providers, or more companies were providing insurance, hospitals were busier, and that put a toll on the nurses. So technological advancements, dialysis and heart bypass and heart and transplants, and all of these rapid technological advances created more and more work for nurses. Nurses said, whoa, this is more than we were expecting. And so collective bargaining started to come up. In the 40s, excuse me, nurses had arbitrary schedules. They had no overtime. They weren't paid for overtime. No health or pension benefits, no sick time. It said that 75% of hospital-employed nurses worked 50 to 60 hours a week, sometimes 7 days a week. It doesn't sound fun, does it? In 1946, the ANA approved a resolution that started to allow collective bargaining. So in 1946, collective bargaining was beginning. The 1960s is when or 1980s is when it really took off. There was a legal battle between the American Nurses Association and the American Hospital Association. In 1980, the National Labor Relations Board stopped approving all RN bargaining units. So there used to be just unions of nurses. Now unions are represented by organizations that also have non-union nurses or non-nurses. Some people think that when you had just unions made of just nurses, it was better for nurses because it was just nurses talking. Other people think that with a non-union, when a non-nurse union represents you, you have more of a coalition of support because you have all these other groups with you. So who represents nurses for collective bargaining? There's basically two organizations. The American Nurses Association actually has their own collective bargaining unit called the United American Nurses. That's part of the ANA. So the UAN, United American Nurses, is part of the ANA, and that is a collective bargaining organization. Now, just by the way, the ANA only has 180,000 members in the country. So that's not a lot. We need to work on that. We need to get more membership. Non-traditional processes, it's also called interest-based bargaining, or IBB. I'm just going to say IBB from this point forward, but that's non-traditional bargaining. Non-traditional bargaining, or IBB, is represented by the Center for the American Nurses, or the CAN. So the CAN is a non-traditional bargaining unit, interest-based bargaining. The UAN is traditional, or union. Do they have any similarities? Yeah, because they take care of all the same issues. They take care of staffing issues and professional performance, objection to an assignment. They both agree with the concept of shared governance, health hazards, clinical and career ladders, and negotiations. So what's the difference between union and IBB? Well, in a union bargaining, you have that union. So you have a union representative, and they speak for everybody. They have the right to negotiate, to create a contract, to sign the contract, and the contract will address things like salaries and benefits, hours worked, duties performed. Contract is binding on both parties. So whatever is agreed to, if the nurses agree to it, they have to abide by that. But so does the hospital or other agency. And it's always negotiated. Nobody gets exactly what they want, but nobody gets totally taken to the cleaners either. There is agreement reached, usually grudgingly, never quickly, but they do find common ground. Interest-based bargaining, non-traditional, is a little different. And that's also called shared governance. Now, Aurora has actually a committee in every hospital called the Aurora System Nurses Association Shared Governance. And what happens there, they're in each individual hospital, but they're also system-wide, is nurses, in this case, nurses try to lead their own practice. They're not a contract agency. They're not bargaining. They're not bargaining for pay, but they're bargaining for workplace practices. They're bargaining for proper protocols and procedures. They may talk about staffing. They may make recommendations about staffing. They don't have authority to make binding statements, but they have the voice of all the nurses. In individual hospitals, the nurses shared governance group has members from every unit and usually every shift, so that you get a broad voice, you get a network of voices on one issue. I've been party to when I was at Aurora, I was on the ASNA committee. It's quite interesting to see the issues that came up and how nurses were actually listened to. So shared governance is not a union bargaining agency. The shared governance does not have the right to create a contract. But it's also not as confrontational as a union. Unions are definitely two people butting heads. Now, sometimes it isn't a lot of butting, but it's always people on different sides of an issue finding a negotiated ground. Unions can be contentious. Unions can create problems between workers and management. But unions also create a contract that is very concrete, binding, and detailed. Shared governance is much more of a work together, but they don't have the authority to create that binding contract. So neither is perfect. They both have their places. Let's come back for part 4, and that'll take us to the end of this learning plan.